Edit: a single dad was replaced by the chairman's son. 3 weeks changed everything. What really happened during those 3 weeks? Could everything truly change in such a short time? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here to share another heartfelt journey with us. If you enjoy stories about resilience, dignity, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. Thank you for watching, for being part of this community, and for encouraging us with every view, like, and kind word. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what do you think can change the most in just 3 weeks? Now, let's step into the beginning of this unforgettable story. The easiest thing in the world to inherit is a title. The hardest thing to earn is respect. The Monday morning air inside Hawthorne Industrial Systems carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee, polished wood, and quiet ambition as employees hurried through the glass lobby with tablets tucked beneath their arms and steaming paper cups in hand. For nearly 12 years, Ethan Walker had arrived before sunrise, turning on lights no one remembered to thank him for, reviewing overnight reports before anyone else logged in, and solving problems long before they reached the executive floor. Most people knew him simply as the operations manager who never raised his voice, never sought attention, and somehow kept the company moving even when everyone else believed success happened naturally. At 39, Ethan had learned that being a single father left little room for pride. Every decision he made revolved around one person waiting at home. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, believed her father could fix anything. He never wanted to prove her wrong. That morning felt different. Conversation stopped as employees received an unexpected calendar notification summoning everyone to the executive conference room. Curious whispers drifted through the hallways while department heads exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan quietly gathered his notebook and walked upstairs without rushing. He had seen enough surprise meetings to know they rarely brought good news. The conference room overlooked the downtown skyline, sunlight reflecting across the polished table where dozens of managers settled into uneasy silence. At exactly 9 o'clock, Chairman Richard Hawthorne entered with confident steps, followed closely by his 28-year-old son, Brandon Hawthorne, whose tailored navy suit looked as though it had never experienced an ordinary workday. Brandon smiled easily, greeting people by name despite having met most of them only once. Richard cleared his throat and folded his hands. "Thank you all for coming." The room became perfectly still. "After careful consideration, our company is entering a new chapter." His voice echoed with practiced authority. "Effective immediately, Brandon Hawthorne will become our new director of operations." Several employees exchanged startled looks before polite applause slowly filled the room. Ethan remained motionless. Richard continued speaking as though reading from a prepared script. "Ethan Walker has served this company faithfully for many years, and we appreciate his contributions. He will assist Brandon during a 3-week transition period before stepping away from the position." The applause faded. Someone near the back lowered their eyes. Someone else quietly sighed. Brandon walked toward Ethan with an extended hand and an effortless smile. "I'm looking forward to learning from you," he said. Ethan stood, accepted the handshake, and answered with calm sincerity, "I hope the company succeeds." Nothing more. No protest. No bitterness. No argument. The silence that followed somehow weighed more than any confrontation could have. Claire Bennett, the company's human resources director, watched the exchange from across the table. She expected disappointment, perhaps even frustration. Instead, she saw something unusual in Ethan's steady expression. It was not defeat. It was quiet dignity, the kind that rarely announced itself but somehow filled an entire room. Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that one decision had just changed the future of everyone inside. And as Ethan calmly gathered his notebook and walked toward the door, no one realized they had just watched the most valuable person in the building quietly begin to disappear. Tuesday arrived without ceremony, yet the atmosphere inside Hawthorne Industrial Systems felt noticeably different. The familiar rhythm of keyboards, ringing phones, and quiet conversations had been replaced by careful glances and unfinished sentences. People worked, but they also watched. Brendan Hawthorne occupied the spacious operations office that had belonged to Ethan for years, rearranging furniture before reading a single project file. Family photographs disappeared from the bookshelf. Process binders that had been organized by color and department were stacked into cardboard boxes. A brand new framed mission statement replaced the simple calendar Ethan had used to track every major client deadline. Brendan leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. "We are going to modernize everything," he announced confidently during the morning leadership meeting. "Old systems create old thinking. We are going to start fresh." Several managers exchanged uncertain looks but nodded politely. Claire Bennett quietly wrote notes without lifting her eyes. Ethan sat near the end of the conference table, answering questions only when someone asked directly. Every explanation was calm, detailed, and surprisingly brief. When Brendan interrupted to say, "I think we can skip that part," Ethan simply nodded and crossed another item off his transition checklist. There was no argument. No attempt to defend years of experience. By lunchtime, Brendan had canceled 2 weekly coordination meetings because they seemed unnecessary. He replaced them with a single online dashboard that promised real-time visibility into every department. The presentation looked impressive. Bright charts covered the large monitor, while colorful graphs climbed steadily upward. Employees applauded politely. Ethan noticed one missing feature immediately. The dashboard collected numbers, but it ignored the relationships between suppliers, shipping schedules, maintenance cycles, and customer priorities that had quietly held everything together for years. He almost spoke. Instead, he remained silent. After the meeting, Claire caught up with him in the hallway. "You could have corrected him," she said softly. Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth he carried through every difficult day. "People rarely learn from being embarrassed," he answered. "Sometimes they have to discover the missing piece themselves." Claire watched him walk away, puzzled by his calm. Most people fought to protect their position. Ethan seemed determined only to protect the company. That afternoon, Brendan proudly sent new operating procedures to every department without asking for final reviews. Several supervisors attempted to clarify conflicting instructions, but Brendan dismissed their concerns with confident optimism. "If everyone simply follows directions, everything will work." Ethan received copies of every email. He responded to each question privately with complete explanations, careful not to undermine Brendan's authority. More than once he solved problems before they reached senior leadership, quietly preventing delays that no one noticed because the crisis never fully appeared. As the workday ended, Ethan shut down his computer exactly at 5:30, something he almost never did before. He drove home through steady evening traffic beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and blue. His aging pickup truck rattled slightly over familiar roads, but the moment he pulled into the driveway, every weight from the office seemed to disappear. Lily burst through the front door wearing mismatched socks and holding a science project covered with colorful construction paper. "Daddy, I got an A+" she shouted before he even stepped out of the truck. Ethan laughed, lifted her into a hug, and admired every handwritten sentence as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. For the first time that entire day, his smile reached his eyes. Inside their modest home, dinner was simple, laughter came easily, and no one cared about job titles. Yet miles away, Inside the glowing offices of Hawthorne Industrial Systems, invisible cracks had already begun spreading beneath the polished surface, and almost no one realized they had started the very moment the quiet architect of the company chose silence instead of pride. By the end of the first week, confidence still echoed through the executive floor, but certainty had quietly begun to fade. Brandon Hawthorne walked briskly from meeting to meeting with polished presentations and ambitious promises, insisting that every department was adjusting exactly as planned. On paper, the numbers appeared stable. In reality, small problems were multiplying beneath the surface, like tiny cracks spreading through solid glass. A shipment that had always arrived on Wednesday showed up 2 days late because a long-trusted supplier had not received the revised scheduling instructions. A manufacturing supervisor waited 3 hours for an approval that used to take 10 minutes. Customer service representatives found themselves apologizing for delays they could not explain. Nobody blamed Brandon openly. They simply worked longer hours, hoping tomorrow would somehow feel easier than today. Claire Bennett noticed the change before anyone else in senior leadership seemed willing to admit it. Employees who once laughed together during lunch now sat quietly, answering emails between bites. Department managers stopped dropping by one another's offices because they were too busy solving unexpected problems. Even the hallways felt different. The familiar energy of teamwork had been replaced by careful uncertainty. One afternoon, Claire walked through the operations floor carrying several personnel files when she overheard 2 veteran supervisors speaking in lowered voices near the warehouse entrance. "Do you remember when Ethan used to catch these issues before they even reached us?" one asked. The other nodded slowly. "He never made a big speech about it. Somehow everything was already fixed before we knew it was broken." They fell silent the moment Claire approached. Neither wanted to sound disloyal. Neither wanted to criticize the chairman's son. But their expressions said more than words ever could. That evening Claire returned to her office instead of heading home. Rain tapped gently against the windows, while the building gradually emptied around her. She opened several archive project folders, searching for historical reports connected to the company's largest accounts. Something immediately caught her attention. Nearly every successful project from the previous decade contained detailed notes, contingency plans, supplier relationships, and handwritten observations signed with the same initials. E.W. She opened another file. Then another. The pattern repeated itself. Whenever a difficult decision had protected an important customer or prevented an expensive delay, Ethan's quiet recommendations appeared somewhere behind the scenes. His name rarely appeared on the final presentation. His fingerprints were simply everywhere else. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the growing stack of documents. She realized she had spent years seeing Ethan as dependable without fully understanding why everyone trusted him so completely. He had never tried to become the face of success. He had simply become its foundation. Meanwhile, Ethan continued arriving every morning with the same calm expression. He spent hours explaining procedures, introducing Brandon to longtime vendors, and documenting information that existed mostly inside his own memory. Brandon often thanked him politely before announcing a completely different approach. Ethan never argued. He answered every question with patience, and then quietly returned to his desk. Late Friday afternoon, a longtime client named Franklin Agricultural Equipment called requesting Ethan directly. The receptionist hesitated before explaining that leadership responsibilities had changed. There was a long pause on the line. Finally, the client replied, "Please tell Mr. Walker that I hope someone is still listening when he speaks." The message reached Ethan minutes later. He smiled gently, thanked the receptionist, and simply said, "They have good people there. Everything will work out." But as he looked through the office windows at employees rushing from one unexpected problem to another, even he could feel that the company had entered unfamiliar territory, and the quiet cost of replacing experience with privilege was only beginning to reveal itself. Saturday mornings always arrived quietly in Ethan Walker's neighborhood, where tree-lined streets, modest homes, and the distant sound of children riding bicycles created a kind of peace that no executive office could ever purchase. Long before the rest of the block came alive, Ethan was already standing in the small kitchen making blueberry pancakes, while Lily sat at the counter, wearing oversized pajamas, carefully measuring flour with complete concentration. She accidentally spilled a little onto the countertop and looked up with worried eyes. Ethan smiled, handed her a clean towel, and said, "Mistakes are easier to clean than regrets. We just fix them together." She laughed, wiped away the flour, and proudly flipped her very first pancake, even though it landed slightly folded. To Ethan, it looked perfect. After breakfast they walked 3 blocks to the neighborhood library, where Lily hurried toward the children's section carrying a canvas bag nearly as large as she was. The librarian greeted Ethan by name, smiling as she handed Lily the newest science books that had finally arrived. While Lily searched for stories about planets and wildlife, Ethan quietly browsed the careers section before returning the books to the shelf unopened. He already knew that no book could teach patience better than life had. Outside, warm sunlight filtered through the maple trees as father and daughter shared a single chocolate chip cookie on a park bench. Lily looked at him with the complete trust that only a child could give. "Daddy, are you still teaching the new boss everything?" she asked. Ethan nodded gently. "I am helping however I can." She tilted her head. "Even after they took your job?" Ethan watched a group of children laughing near the playground before answering. "Doing the right thing should never depend on how someone else treats you." Lily considered those words carefully before slipping her small hand into his. "Grandma always said kind people are strong people." Ethan smiled. "She was a very wise woman." The afternoon passed with ordinary moments that quietly became extraordinary simply because they were shared together. They watered flowers in the tiny front yard, repaired the loose wheel on Lily's bicycle, and spent nearly an hour building a cardboard model of the solar system across the dining room table. Every laugh inside that little house carried more meaning than every applause Ethan had ever received at work. As evening settled across the neighborhood, Ethan sat on the front porch while Lily colored pictures beside him. A cool summer breeze moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. His cell phone buzzed twice, with work emails asking for clarification about inventory procedures. He answered each question with detailed instructions before setting the phone aside without complaint. Across town, however, another Saturday looked very different. Brendan Hawthorne remained inside the nearly empty corporate headquarters surrounded by spreadsheets, revised schedules, and unanswered messages from department managers. Every solution seemed to create 2 new questions. Every adjustment revealed another overlooked detail. Frustration slowly replaced confidence, although he refused to admit it aloud. Meanwhile, Claire Bennett continued reviewing archive files from home, spreading printed reports across her dining room table. The more documents she examined, the more impossible it became to ignore the same quiet truth. Ethan had never built his reputation through speeches, recognition, or ambition. He had built it one thoughtful decision at a time until an entire company unknowingly depended upon his judgment. And while most people believed leadership belonged to the person sitting in the largest office, Claire was beginning to understand that true leadership often went home each evening to help an 8-year-old finish her homework before quietly answering one more email from the company that no longer seemed to recognize its greatest strength. Monday morning marked the beginning of the 3rd week, and for the first time in the company's history, uncertainty reached the executive floor before the employees did. The elevators opened to unusually quiet hallways where conversation stopped the moment someone from senior management walked past. Overnight reports filled inboxes with delays, missed milestones, and customer concerns that had never appeared together before. Brandon Hawthorne stared at the growing list of notifications on his computer screen, refreshing the dashboard again and again, as though different numbers might suddenly appear. Instead, another urgent message arrived. Franklin Agricultural Equipment, the company's largest client, had requested an emergency conference call at 9 o'clock. Every department head gathered around the long conference table while the large display connected to the client's headquarters. The voice on the speaker remained professional, yet impossible to misunderstand. "We have worked with your company for almost 15 years because your team always solved problems before they became emergencies. During the past 2 weeks, we have experienced shipment delays, conflicting updates, and unanswered questions. We need confidence, not promises." Brandon straightened his tie and responded with practiced optimism. "We appreciate your patience. We are implementing a more efficient operating structure." There was a brief silence before the client answered. "Efficiency is measured by results, not presentations." The call ended without another word. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Richard Hawthorne slowly removed his glasses and looked around the room. Even he could sense the confidence that had filled these meetings only weeks earlier had quietly disappeared. Brandon immediately began assigning new action plans, requesting revised reports and additional performance reviews, believing more meetings would solve what better judgment once prevented. Managers hurried back to their departments, but confusion only deepened. Purchasing waited for approvals that logistics assumed had already been granted. Production schedules conflicted with transportation bookings. Customer service representatives apologized repeatedly while struggling to provide accurate delivery dates. Every problem seemed unrelated until Claire Bennett noticed something remarkable. Every issue traced back to one missing connection, a decision that Ethan had once handled almost automatically without creating attention for himself. She returned to her office and opened another archive, comparing operational records from previous years with current activity. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Ethan had quietly connected departments that rarely communicated directly. He remembered supplier preferences, seasonal shipping challenges, maintenance schedules, customer expectations, and countless details that no software dashboard had ever recorded. Those details had never appeared in executive summaries because they had never become problems. Meanwhile, Ethan continued working through his transition assignments with steady professionalism. Several employees privately thanked him for answering questions even after losing his position. He simply smiled and reminded each person to support the team. Late that afternoon, he finished documenting another process guide, placed it neatly inside Brandon's inbox, and prepared to leave on time so he could attend Lily's school science fair. As he walked toward the parking lot, he noticed dark clouds gathering above the city skyline, carrying the promise of an evening storm. His phone vibrated with another request for clarification from the office. He answered carefully, wished the employee a good evening, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across town, Lily waited beside her classroom display with hopeful excitement, believing her father would never miss an important moment. Ethan smiled as he pulled into the school parking lot, unaware that while he celebrated his daughter's achievement, the company he had quietly held together for more than a decade was moving closer to the kind of crisis that could no longer be hidden behind polished speeches or inherited authority. The storm arrived just after sunrise on Wednesday, not in the form of thunder or heavy rain, but as a chain of phone calls that no executive wanted to answer. Before 8 o'clock, 3 regional managers reported delayed shipments. By 8:30, 2 suppliers refused to release inventory until conflicting purchase orders were clarified. At 9:15, customer service recorded its highest number of urgent requests in more than a decade. Every department searched for answers, yet every answer seemed to lead to another unanswered question. Brandon Hawthorne stood in the operations center surrounded by large digital displays filled with colorful charts that no longer reflected reality. He issued new instructions almost every hour, hoping decisive action would restore confidence. Instead, each revision created fresh confusion because different departments were following different versions of the same plan. Employees hurried through the hallways carrying folders, laptops, and coffee cups that had long since gone cold. Nobody complained aloud, but exhaustion had begun replacing optimism. Claire Bennett watched the growing tension with increasing concern. She gathered several department supervisors inside a small conference room, asking each one to describe the biggest obstacle facing their teams. At first, the problem sounded unrelated. Shipping blamed scheduling. Scheduling blamed purchasing. Purchasing blamed inventory. Then one warehouse supervisor quietly said, "The problem is not any single department. We have stopped talking to one another." The room became silent. Claire looked around the table and realized everyone understood exactly what he meant. Ethan had never managed operations by relying only on reports. He had connected people. He remembered who needed an extra phone call, which supplier preferred early morning updates, which customer valued honesty over speed, and which department always required an additional reminder before major deadlines. Those habits had seemed ordinary because they happened every day. Only after they disappeared did everyone recognize their value. Claire returned to her office and opened years of archived correspondence, reading through hundreds of emails that Ethan had written. None of them sought recognition. None of them claimed credit. Nearly every message ended with the same quiet purpose, making sure someone else had what they needed to succeed. She closed her laptop and stared through the office window as employees moved quickly below. The company had mistaken humility for simplicity. At almost the same moment, Richard Hawthorne entered Brandon's office carrying several printed reports. His expression remained calm, but disappointment was becoming impossible to hide. "Explain these numbers," he said quietly. Brandon reviewed the pages and immediately began describing software adjustments, temporary disruptions, and employee resistance to change. Richard listened without interruption before asking a single question. "Who understands this entire operation better than anyone else?" Brandon hesitated. For the first time since becoming director of operations, confidence gave way to uncomfortable honesty. He lowered his eyes and answered softly, "Ethan." Richard said nothing more. The silence itself felt heavier than criticism. Across town, Ethan spent his lunch break sitting on a wooden bench outside Lily's elementary school after volunteering to help students prepare for the upcoming science showcase. Watching children laugh beneath the bright afternoon sun reminded him that life always became clearer when measured by people instead of positions. As he prepared to return to the office for another afternoon of transition work, his phone remained unusually quiet. He did not know that inside the executive suite, conversations had finally begun shifting away from protecting titles and toward searching for the one person whose quiet wisdom had held an entire company together all along. Thursday morning began with something the employees had not experienced in years. The executive conference room was completely silent before the meeting even started. Nobody exchanged casual greetings. Coffee sat untouched beside open notebooks, while department heads avoided looking at one another. Richard Hawthorne entered first, followed by Brandon, whose usual confidence had been replaced by visible fatigue. Claire Bennett carried a thick folder of reports and quietly took her seat. Richard looked around the room before speaking in a measured voice. "I do not want excuses. I want solutions." No one answered immediately. The latest operational report showed missed delivery targets, declining customer satisfaction, and growing supplier concerns. Then Claire slowly opened her folder. "I believe we have been trying to repair symptoms instead of identifying the cause," she said. She placed several documents on the table. They were years of project summaries, operational notes, customer correspondence, and process reviews. Every file pointed toward the same conclusion. These are the systems that kept this company running. Most of them were designed, refined, or personally coordinated by Ethan Walker. Brandon looked down at the papers without saying a word. Richard carefully turned each page, noticing details he had never taken time to read before. Customer recovery plans, emergency supplier contacts, seasonal production adjustments, personal notes reminding managers to check on employees working overtime. None of those details had appeared in executive presentations because Ethan had never written them for recognition. He had written them so someone else would succeed. Claire continued quietly. We believe we were replacing a position. In reality, we removed the person connecting every department together. The room remained silent. Finally, Richard closed the folder and looked toward Brandon. Can you restore these operations by yourself? Brandon hesitated for several long seconds before slowly shaking his head. Pride fought against honesty, but honesty finally won. No, he admitted. I cannot. Richard nodded once. Then we ask for help. Less than an hour later, Claire found Ethan in a small conference room completing another transition guide. His desk had already been partially cleared, leaving only a family photograph of Lily, a notebook filled with handwritten reminders, and a simple ceramic coffee mug. Ethan looked up with his usual calm smile. Good morning, Claire. Is there something else the team needs documented? Claire sat across from him and took a quiet breath before speaking. The company needs more than documentation. She explained everything without exaggeration. The growing confusion, the frustrated customers, the suppliers losing confidence, the leadership team finally recognizing how much of the operation depended upon relationships that Ethan had built over many years. When she finished, Ethan remained thoughtful rather than emotional. He glanced briefly at the photograph of Lily before asking only one question. How are the employees holding up? Claire blinked in surprise. She had expected questions about titles, compensation, or apologies. Instead, he wanted to know whether everyone else was managing. They are doing their best, she answered honestly. Ethan nodded slowly. Then let us help them. Claire looked at him with genuine admiration. You are not asking for your position back? Ethan smiled gently. Positions come and go. Good people should not lose sleep because of a difficult season. As they stood and walked together toward the executive floor, neither of them realized that employees throughout the building had quietly begun watching through office windows and hallway doors. Word spread faster than any official announcement. Ethan Walker was coming back, not to reclaim authority, not to prove anyone wrong, but simply to help the people who had never stopped believing in the quiet leader whose greatest strength had always been choosing responsibility over recognition. By Friday morning, the atmosphere inside Hawthorne Industrial Systems had begun to change in ways that no performance report could measure. Ethan Walker did not return with dramatic speeches or sweeping announcements. He walked through the front entrance carrying the same worn leather notebook he had used for years, greeting the receptionist by name, thanking the maintenance crew for arriving early, and stopping briefly to ask a warehouse employee how his wife was recovering from surgery. Those simple conversations reminded everyone that Ethan had never managed a business by memorizing numbers alone. He remembered people. Within the first hour, he gathered representatives from purchasing, logistics, production, customer service, and shipping around a single conference table. There were no elaborate presentations and no complicated charts. Ethan simply smiled and said, "Let us start by listening to one another." One by one, each department described its challenges, while the others listened without interruption. As the conversation continued, Disconnected problems slowly revealed themselves as pieces of the same puzzle. Ethan wrote short notes across several pages before quietly assigning practical solutions. Purchasing would call suppliers directly instead of relying only on automated notifications. Logistics would restore the communication schedule that had existed before the transition. Customer service would contact key clients personally to explain realistic timelines instead of making uncertain promises. Every instruction was clear, respectful, and focused on cooperation rather than blame. Employees left the room with something they had not felt in weeks: confidence. Throughout the afternoon, phones that had carried complaints began receiving messages of appreciation from customers who simply wanted honest communication. Longtime suppliers welcomed Ethan's familiar voice with visible relief, agreeing to adjust deliveries because they trusted his word. Franklin Agricultural Equipment accepted a revised production schedule after Ethan personally explained every step of the recovery plan. "I knew you would tell us the truth," the client's president said before ending the call. Ethan thanked him without mentioning that he no longer officially held the leadership position. Richard Hawthorne watched much of the day from the executive floor through the glass walls overlooking the operations center. He noticed employees smiling again. Managers stopped rushing from crisis to crisis because they were finally speaking with one another instead of through disconnected reports. Even Brandon stood quietly near the back of the operations room, observing Ethan's calm leadership without interruption. For the first time, he saw details that no business school presentation had ever explained. Leadership was not controlling every conversation. Leadership was creating an environment where everyone else could succeed together. Late that afternoon, Richard asked Claire to bring him the original recommendation letters written during Ethan's first years with the company. As he read through them, one sentence caught his attention. It had been written by a retired executive more than a decade earlier. "Ethan Walker has an unusual gift. People trust him because he always places the mission ahead of himself." Richard slowly lowered the page and closed his eyes. He realized that over the years, he had celebrated visible success while overlooking the quiet character that made such success possible. Downstairs, Ethan finished another meeting and thanked every employee for their hard work before collecting his notebook. As he prepared to leave in time to have dinner with Lily, Brandon approached him with unsteady confidence. He hesitated before finally speaking. "I thought leadership meant having the right answers," he admitted softly. Ethan smiled with the same quiet grace that had carried him through every difficult day. "The best leaders spend more time asking the right questions." Brandon nodded silently, understanding that the greatest lesson he had received during those 3 weeks had never been written inside a management manual, but had been demonstrated every day by the man whose dignity had quietly transformed an entire company without ever demanding recognition. The following Monday, every employee received an invitation to an all-company meeting in the main auditorium. This time the room filled with curiosity instead of uncertainty. Managers stood beside warehouse employees. Receptionists sat next to executives. The quiet conversations that echoed through the room all seemed to circle around the same question: what would happen next? Richard Hawthorne stepped onto the stage without his usual prepared speech. For several moments, he simply looked across the audience before speaking. "A leader's greatest responsibility is not avoiding mistakes. It is admitting them when they happen." The room became perfectly still. Richard continued in a calm voice. 3 weeks ago, I believed I was making a decision for the future of this company. Instead, I failed to recognize the person who had already been protecting that future for many years." He turned toward Ethan, who remained standing quietly near the side of the stage. "Ethan Walker, would you please join me?" Soft applause began somewhere near the back of the auditorium, and quickly spread throughout the room until every employee was on their feet. Ethan walked forward with the same humble expression he had worn every day, offering a polite nod rather than celebrating the moment. Richard extended his hand, but before speaking again, he paused. On behalf of this company, I owe you an apology. The words surprised everyone because they came not from obligation, but from genuine conviction. You gave this organization your wisdom, your patience, and your integrity. We accepted those gifts without fully appreciating them. That was my failure. Ethan accepted the handshake warmly. Thank you, Richard, he replied. We all want the same thing. We want this company and its people to succeed. Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. If you are willing, I would like you to return as Director of Operations, with full authority to rebuild the systems you created and help prepare the next generation of leaders. Ethan thought quietly for a moment before answering. I will gladly accept, but only if we build those systems together. A strong company should never depend on one person alone. Several employees nodded as applause filled the auditorium once again. Brandon stepped forward next. His voice carried none of the confidence that had once defined him, only sincerity. I believe my last name made me ready to lead, he admitted. You showed me that leadership is earned through service, consistency, and respect. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I should have learned much sooner. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Brandon's shoulder. Learning is never a sign of weakness. Refusing to learn is. The room fell into thoughtful silence before another wave of applause echoed through the building. Later that evening, Ethan arrived home just before sunset. Lily ran across the front yard and wrapped her arms around him. Did you have a good day, Daddy? She asked with a bright smile. Ethan looked toward the golden light stretching across the quiet neighborhood before answering. Yes, he said gently. It was a very good day. They sat together on the front porch sharing lemonade, while the evening breeze rustled through the trees. Inside his briefcase rested a new employment agreement, but it was not the document that brought him peace. What mattered most was knowing that kindness had never been weakness, humility had never been failure, and quiet dignity had finally been seen. Some people inherit positions. Others earn trust. In the end, titles may open doors, but character is what invites people to walk beside you long after the applause has faded.